You think you know what's really happening behind the scenes in WWE. You think Triple H taking over creative control was just a smooth transition that everyone's happy about. Well, buckle up because I'm about to expose the absolute chaos, backstage politics, and career-ending decisions that are tearing WWE apart from the inside out right now. And before you start typing fake news or clickbait in the comments, I want you to stick around because every single thing I'm about to tell you is backed up by insider sources, leaked conversations, and patterns of behavior that WWE is desperately trying to hide from the wrestling world. This isn't just about creative differences, this is about the complete systematic destruction of everything Vince McMahon spent decades building, and some of your favorite superstars are paying the ultimate price. We're talking about careers being buried, million-dollar contracts being ignored, and creative decisions so controversial that they're causing walkouts, heated confrontations, and threats of legal action behind the scenes. Triple H isn't just changing WWE, he's burning it to the ground and rebuilding it in his own image, and he doesn't care whose career gets destroyed in the process. The Vince McMahon era. Understanding what we lost. Let's start with some uncomfortable truths that the wrestling world needs to acknowledge. Say whatever you want about Vince McMahon's creative decisions, his micromanagement style, or his outdated perspectives on modern entertainment. The man knew how to make money and create superstars that transcended the wrestling business. For over 4 decades, Vince McMahon's WWE machine created household names, generated billions in revenue, and established professional wrestling as a legitimate form of mainstream entertainment. Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, John Cena, Roman Reigns. These weren't just wrestlers, they were cultural phenomena that reached audiences far beyond traditional wrestling fans. But here's what most fans don't understand about Vince's approach. Every creative decision, no matter how bizarre or controversial, was made with long-term business strategy in mind. Vince didn't just book wrestling matches, he orchestrated cultural moments that would generate revenue streams for decades. Think about the Attitude Era. Vince didn't accidentally stumble into the most profitable period in wrestling history. He systematically analyzed what audiences wanted, what his competition was doing, and what cultural trends were emerging, then created programming that capitalized on all of those factors simultaneously. The result was appointment television that drew millions of viewers and created generational wealth for WWE. The Ruthless Aggression era wasn't just about finding the next big star. It was about establishing WWE's dominance in a post-WCW landscape while transitioning the business model toward more diverse revenue streams. The PG era wasn't just about appealing to families, it was about creating content that could be monetized globally and attract corporate sponsors who had previously avoided wrestling. Even Vince's most criticized decisions usually had sound business logic behind them. The Roman Reigns push that fans complained about for years. It was based on Roman's merchandise sales, international appeal, and demographic data that showed he was connecting with WWE's target audiences even when vocal fans rejected him. Now, I'm not here to defend every decision Vince McMahon ever made. The man was far from perfect, and some of his creative choices were genuinely problematic. But what cannot be denied is that Vince understood the wrestling business in ways that very few people ever have. He knew how to identify talent, develop characters, and create moments that would resonate with audiences for years. More importantly, Vince understood that WWE wasn't just a wrestling company, it was an entertainment conglomerate that happened to use wrestling as its primary content vehicle. This perspective allowed him to make decisions that prioritized long-term business growth over short-term fan satisfaction, and while that approach was often frustrating for fans, it's exactly why WWE became the global powerhouse it is today. Triple H's vision. The NXT philosophy gone corporate. When Triple H assumed control of WWE's creative direction, he brought with him the philosophy and approach that had made NXT successful during his tenure running that brand. On the surface, this seemed like exactly what WWE needed. A focus on in-ring competition, character development, and storytelling that respected wrestling tradition while embracing modern production values. The NXT model under Triple H's leadership had been genuinely impressive. He had taken developmental talent and created compelling programming that felt both contemporary and authentic to wrestling's roots. NXT had developed a reputation for exceptional match quality, coherent storytelling, and character development that felt organic rather than forced. But here's where the problems began. What works for a 1-hour weekly show with a focused roster and specific target audience doesn't necessarily translate to WWE's main roster programming. NXT operated with different constraints, different expectations, and different business pressures than Raw and SmackDown. Triple H's approach to creative development emphasizes long-term storytelling, character complexity, and in-ring competition as the primary drivers of audience engagement. This philosophy assumes that audiences are willing to invest time and attention in gradual character development and sophisticated storylines that unfold over months or years. In the NXT environment, this approach worked beautifully. NXT's audience consisted primarily of dedicated wrestling fans who were specifically seeking that type of content. They were willing to follow complex storylines, appreciate subtle character development, and invest emotionally in performers they had watched grow and develop over time. But WWE's main roster operates in a completely different ecosystem. Raw and SmackDown need to attract and maintain casual audiences who might not watch every week, international audiences with different cultural contexts, and demographic segments who are seeking different types of entertainment experiences. Triple H's creative philosophy also emphasizes authenticity and performer input in ways that weren't typical during the Vince McMahon era. Under Triple H's leadership, performers have more creative control over their characters, more input into storyline development, and more freedom to express their individual personalities and creative visions. Again, this approach had worked well in NXT where the roster was smaller and Triple H could work closely with individual performers to develop their characters collaboratively. But scaling this approach to WWE's massive main roster has created complexities and challenges that weren't anticipated. The roster divide. Why some superstars are thriving while others are dying. Here's where we get into the really controversial stuff that WWE doesn't want discussed publicly. Triple H's creative approach has created a clear divide within WWE's roster between performers who fit his vision and those who don't, and that divide is having dramatic impacts on careers, storylines, and backstage morale. The performers who are thriving under Triple H's leadership tend to share certain characteristics. They're technically proficient in ring competitors, they're comfortable with collaborative creative processes, they have clear character concepts that translate well to longer-term storytelling, and they fit the aesthetic and stylistic preferences that Triple H developed during his NXT tenure. Look at performers like Cody Rhodes, Seth Rollins, Rhea Ripley, and Gunther. These are wrestlers who have seen their stock rise significantly under Triple H's creative direction. They're getting more meaningful storylines, better character development, and more opportunities to showcase their abilities in ways that feel authentic to their strengths. But here's the other side of that equation. Performers whose strengths don't align with Triple H's creative philosophy are finding themselves marginalized, depushed, or completely written off television. And we're not talking about low-level talent here, we're talking about established performers who were major stars under Vince McMahon's creative direction. According to multiple backstage sources, there's growing frustration among certain segments of the roster who feel that their careers have stagnated or declined under Triple H's leadership. These aren't just complaints about reduced screen time, these are concerns about fundamental changes in how WWE approaches character development and storytelling. Some performers who thrived under Vince's approach to character work are struggling to adapt to Triple H's more collaborative and authenticity-focused creative process. Under Vince's system, performers were often given clear character directions and expectations, then judged primarily on their ability to execute those directions effectively. Triple H's system expects performers to contribute more actively to their own character development, to have clear creative visions for their personas, and to be able to articulate and execute complex storytelling concepts. For performers who were comfortable with Vince's more directive approach, this transition has been challenging. But the roster divide goes deeper than just creative processes. There are also philosophical differences about what makes for compelling wrestling entertainment. Triple H's background and preferences lean heavily toward technical wrestling, complex character psychology, and storytelling that rewards long-term audience investment. This approach naturally favors performers who excel in those areas while potentially disadvantaging performers whose strengths lie in other aspects of sports entertainment. Charisma, larger-than-life personas, or the kind of spectacle-based entertainment that was central to many of Vince's most successful eras. The ratings reality. Numbers don't lie about audience response. Now let's talk about something that WWE executives are definitely monitoring closely but probably don't want discussed publicly. How audience metrics and engagement numbers have changed since Triple H assumed creative control, and what those changes reveal about the effectiveness of his creative vision. Television ratings are the most obvious metric, but they're also the most complicated to analyze because they're influenced by factors beyond creative content. Streaming competition, changing viewing habits, seasonal variations, and broader entertainment industry trends all impact wrestling viewership. That said, the patterns in WWE's ratings since Triple H took over creative control are worth examining. While overall viewership has remained relatively stable, there have been notable changes in audience composition, engagement patterns, and demographic performance that suggest Triple H's creative approach is resonating differently with different segments of WWE's audience. The most significant change has been in audience engagement metrics, social media interaction, streaming platform performance, and international viewership patterns. These metrics suggest that Triple H's creative approach is generating higher levels of engagement from certain demographic segments while potentially losing ground with others. According to industry analytics, WWE's content under Triple H's creative direction tends to perform better with audiences who are already invested in wrestling as a form of entertainment. The emphasis on in-ring competition, character complexity, and long-term storytelling appeals to viewers who are seeking deeper engagement with wrestling content. But there are also concerning trends in casual viewership and audience retention that suggest Triple H's approach might be making WWE programming less accessible to viewers who aren't already committed wrestling fans. The collaborative creative process and emphasis on authenticity that works well for dedicated fans might be creating barriers for casual viewers. International performance metrics are particularly interesting because they reveal how Triple H's creative changes are playing in different cultural contexts. Some international markets have responded very positively to the increased emphasis on in-ring competition and character development. Other markets, particularly those where Vince's more spectacle-focused approach was popular, have shown declining engagement. Streaming platform performance has been generally positive under Triple H's creative direction, which makes sense given that streaming audiences tend to be more engaged and committed to the content they choose to watch. The longer-form storytelling and character development that characterizes Triple H's approach works particularly well in streaming environments where audiences are making deliberate viewing choices. But perhaps the most telling metric is merchandise sales and revenue generation from different performer segments. While overall WWE revenue has remained strong, there have been notable shifts in which performers are driving sales and which demographic segments are making purchases. The creative philosophy clash. Art versus commerce in sports entertainment. Here's where we get into the fundamental philosophical differences that are creating tension within WWE's creative environment. Triple H's approach to wrestling entertainment prioritizes artistic integrity and authentic storytelling in ways that sometimes conflict with pure commercial considerations. This isn't necessarily a criticism. Many of the most memorable and culturally significant wrestling moments have come from creators who prioritized artistic vision over immediate commercial concerns. But it does represent a significant departure from Vince McMahon's approach, which always kept commercial viability as the primary consideration in creative decisions. Triple H's background as a performer gives him a different perspective on character development and storytelling than Vince's background as a business executive. Triple H understands the performer's experience in ways that inform his creative decisions. He knows what it feels like to be asked to portray characters that don't feel authentic, to work storylines that don't make logical sense, and to navigate the pressure of carrying major storylines. This performer's perspective has led to creative decisions that prioritize character authenticity, logical storytelling progression, and performer satisfaction in ways that weren't always priorities under Vince's leadership. The result is often more satisfying creative content from an artistic standpoint, but it also creates new challenges from a business perspective. Authentic character development takes time, and time is a luxury that weekly television programming doesn't always provide. Vince's approach often involved creating immediate impact through dramatic character changes, shocking storyline developments, and spectacle that could capture attention quickly. Triple H's approach requires audiences to invest more time and attention to fully appreciate the creative content, which can create better long-term engagement but might sacrifice some of the immediate impact that drives casual viewership and social media buzz. The philosophical differences also extend to how WWE approaches talent development and career trajectory management. Vince's system was often criticized for being too controlling, but it also provided clear paths for career advancement and character development that helped performers understand how to succeed within WWE's system. Triple H's more collaborative approach gives performers more creative freedom, but it also places more responsibility on individual performers to drive their own character development and career progression. For performers who thrive in collaborative creative environments, this is liberating and empowering. For performers who prefer clearer direction and structure, it can be confusing and frustrating. The backstage power structure. How everything changed overnight. When Triple H assumed creative control of WWE, it wasn't just a change in leadership. It was a complete restructuring of how creative decisions are made, who has influence over storyline development, and how the entire backstage power structure operates. Under Vince McMahon's leadership, WWE operated with a very clear hierarchy. Vince made final decisions on all major creative elements, with input from a small circle of trusted advisors. This system was often criticized for being too centralized, but it also provided clear lines of authority and decision-making processes that everyone understood. Triple H's approach has decentralized creative authority in ways that have fundamentally changed how WWE operates behind the scenes. Creative decisions now involve more stakeholders, more collaborative processes, and more input from performers themselves. This decentralization has created opportunities for performers who were previously excluded from creative decision-making to have more influence over their characters and storylines. But it has also created new forms of backstage politics and competition that weren't present under Vince's more centralized system. According to multiple backstage sources, the transition to Triple H's more collaborative creative process has created situations where performers are essentially competing for creative attention and storyline priority in ways that weren't typical under Vince's leadership. Under Vince's system, creative decisions were made primarily by Vince himself, with limited input from performers. This meant that performer lobbying and backstage politics had less direct impact on creative outcomes. Under Triple H's system, performer input carries more weight, which naturally creates more opportunities for backstage maneuvering and political considerations to influence creative decisions. The power structure changes have also affected WWE's writing team and creative staff. Under Vince's leadership, writers were primarily tasked with executing Vince's creative vision and translating his ideas into specific storyline content. Under Triple H's leadership, writers have more creative autonomy and are expected to contribute more actively to storyline development and character creation. This has been liberating for some writers who felt constrained under Vince's system, but it has also created new pressures and expectations that not all writers have been able to adapt to successfully. The changes in backstage power structure have also influenced how WWE approaches talent relations and contract negotiations. Under Vince's system, creative opportunities were largely determined by Vince's assessment of individual performers and business considerations. Under Triple H's system, creative opportunities are influenced by more factors, including performer input, collaborative potential, and fit with longer-term storyline plans. This has created new opportunities for some performers while potentially limiting opportunities for others who thrived under the previous system. The international impact. How global markets are responding. One of the most significant but underreported aspects of Triple H's creative direction is how it's affecting WWE's performance in international markets, and why those changes matter more than most fans realize for WWE's long-term business strategy. WWE's international expansion has been one of their most important business initiatives in recent years, with significant investments in markets like India, the Middle East, Europe, and parts of Asia where wrestling hadn't previously been popular. The success of these expansion efforts depends heavily on creating content that resonates with international audiences while maintaining appeal for domestic viewers. Vince McMahon's approach to international markets was largely based on spectacle, larger-than-life characters, and storytelling concepts that could translate across cultural boundaries without requiring deep cultural knowledge or long-term investment from viewers. Triple H's approach, with its emphasis on character complexity, long-term storytelling, and authenticity, creates different challenges and opportunities in international markets. Some aspects of his creative philosophy translate very well internationally. The emphasis on in-ring competition and athletic achievement resonates strongly in markets where sport is highly valued. But other aspects of Triple H's approach require cultural context and long-term audience investment that can be challenging to develop in new international markets. Complex character development and nuanced storytelling work best with audiences who are already committed to following wrestling programming regularly. According to industry sources familiar with WWE's international business, the response to Triple H's creative direction has been mixed across different international markets. Some markets, particularly those with strong wrestling traditions or sports-focused entertainment cultures, have responded very positively to the increased emphasis on in-ring competition and athletic storytelling. Other markets, particularly those where WWE was successful primarily because of spectacle and larger-than-life entertainment, have shown declining engagement with programming under Triple H's creative direction. The international response patterns are important because they reveal something significant about the sustainability of Triple H's creative approach. If his philosophy can successfully expand WWE's appeal in key international markets, it validates the long-term viability of his creative vision. If it struggles to connect with international audiences, it might indicate limitations that could affect WWE's global growth strategy. The generational divide. Why older fans and younger fans want different things. Here's something that's creating real tension within WWE's fanbase that the company is definitely aware of but probably doesn't want to address directly. Triple H's creative approach appeals very differently to different generational segments of WWE's audience, and those differences are creating challenges for how WWE develops content that satisfies their entire fanbase. Older wrestling fans who grew up during the Attitude Era, the Monday Night Wars, or earlier periods of wrestling history tend to have different expectations and preferences than younger fans who discovered wrestling more recently or who primarily engage with wrestling through social media and streaming platforms. Older fans often prefer the spectacle, larger-than-life characters, and dramatic storyline developments that were hallmarks of wrestling's most culturally significant periods. They're looking for wrestling content that captures the cultural excitement and mainstream relevance that wrestling achieved during those eras. Younger fans, particularly those who discovered wrestling through NXT, independent promotions, or international wrestling, often prefer the technical excellence, authentic character development, and sophisticated storytelling that characterizes Triple H's creative approach. This generational divide creates a real challenge for WWE's creative team. Content that satisfies older fans might feel dated or unsophisticated to younger audiences. Content that appeals to younger fans might feel inaccessible or overly complex to older viewers who prefer more straightforward entertainment. Triple H's creative direction has generally leaned toward appealing to younger, more engaged wrestling fans rather than trying to recapture the mainstream casual audience that wrestling achieved during its peak cultural periods. This makes sense from one perspective. Younger audiences represent the future of wrestling viewership and are more likely to engage with wrestling content across multiple platforms. But it also represents a significant strategic choice about WWE's long-term direction. By prioritizing engaged wrestling fans over casual mainstream audiences, Triple H is essentially betting that wrestling's future success comes from deepening engagement with committed fans rather than expanding appeal to broader audiences. The generational divide also affects how different segments of WWE's audience respond to specific performers and storylines. Performers who embody Triple H's approach to character development and storytelling tend to be more popular with younger, more engaged fans. Performers who represent older approaches to wrestling entertainment might struggle to connect with audiences who prefer Triple H's creative philosophy. The women's division revolution. Success story or missed opportunity. One area where Triple H's creative approach has generated significant positive response is WWE's women's division, but even this success story reveals some of the complexities and trade-offs involved in his overall creative philosophy. Under Vince McMahon's leadership, WWE's women's division underwent significant evolution, particularly during the later years of his tenure. The women's evolution period saw increased opportunities, better storylines, and more prominent positioning for female performers than had been typical in previous eras. But Triple H's approach to the women's division has taken that evolution even further, emphasizing character development, in-ring competition, and storytelling complexity in ways that have created some of the most compelling women's wrestling content in WWE history. Performers like Rhea Ripley, Bianca Belair, Becky Lynch, and others have thrived under Triple H's creative direction, receiving storylines that feel substantial and important rather than secondary to men's programming. The women's division under Triple H's leadership often feels more integrated into WWE's overall creative vision rather than segregated as separate content. But the women's division's success also highlights some of the challenges with Triple H's overall approach. The women who have been most successful under his creative direction tend to be performers who fit his preferred model: technically proficient, comfortable with collaborative creative processes, and suited to longer-term character development. Women performers whose strengths lie in other areas, pure charisma, entertainment value, or spectacle-based presentation, have had more mixed results under Triple H's creative direction. This isn't necessarily a criticism, but it does illustrate how Triple H's creative preferences influence opportunities across the entire roster. The international response to WWE's women's division under Triple H's leadership has been particularly interesting. In some international markets, the increased prominence and complexity of women's storylines has been very well received and has helped expand WWE's audience to include more female viewers. In other international markets, particularly those with more conservative cultural attitudes toward women's sports and entertainment, the changes have been less positively received. This creates challenges for WWE's international expansion efforts and requires careful cultural adaptation in different markets. The tag team division, where creative philosophy meets practical challenges. The tag team division under Triple H's creative leadership provides an interesting case study in how his creative philosophy works in practice, and why some aspects of his approach are more successful than others. Triple H has clearly prioritized the tag team division in ways that weren't typical under Vince McMahon's later creative periods. Tag teams are receiving more screen time, better storylines, and more opportunities to be featured prominently in major storylines and events. Teams like the Usos, New Day, and various combinations of performers have been given substantial creative content and important positions within WWE's overall storytelling structure. The tag team division feels more integral to WWE's programming rather than being treated as secondary content. But the tag team division also reveals some of the practical challenges with Triple H's collaborative creative approach. Tag team wrestling requires coordination not just between the performers in the ring, but between multiple creative visions, character concepts, and long-term career goals. Under Vince's more directive creative system, tag teams were often given clear roles and expectations that aligned with overall creative priorities. Under Triple H's more collaborative system, tag teams have to navigate multiple creative inputs and potentially conflicting individual career objectives. This has led to some very successful tag team storylines and character development, but it has also created situations where tag team storylines become overly complex or lose focus because they're trying to serve too many different creative objectives simultaneously. The international response to WWE's tag team division under Triple H has been generally positive, particularly in markets where tag team wrestling has strong traditions or where audiences appreciate technical wrestling excellence. But the tag team division also illustrates one of the broader challenges with Triple H's creative approach. The emphasis on authenticity and performer input can sometimes create content that is deeply satisfying for committed wrestling fans but might be less accessible for casual viewers who prefer more straightforward entertainment.